Okay, this is page 152 in chapter 8, right at the top. It was dawn on Long Island, and we went about opening the rest of the windows downstairs, filling the house. Wait, did I read? No, okay. Filling the house with gold-turning light. The shadow of a tree fell abruptly across the dew, and ghostly birds began to sing among the blue leaves. There was a slow, pleasant movement in the air, scarcely a wind, promising a cool, lovely day. I don't think she ever loved him. Gatsby turned around from a window and looked at me challengingly. You must remember, old sport, she was very excited this afternoon. He told her those things in a way that frightened her, that made it look as if I was some kind of cheap sharper. And the result was she hardly knew what she was saying. He sat down gloomily. Of course, she might have loved him for just a minute when they were first married, and loved me more even then. Do you see? Suddenly he came out with a curious remark. In any case, he said, it was just personal. What could you make of that, except to suspect some intensity in his conception of the affair that couldn't be measured? He came back from France when Tom and Daisy were still on their wedding trip and made a miserable but irresistible journey to Louisville on the last of his army pay. He stayed there a week, walking the streets where their footsteps had clicked together through the November night and revisiting the out-of-the-way places to which they had driven in her white car. Just as Daisy's house had always seemed to him more mysterious and gay than other houses, so his idea of the city itself, even though she was gone from it, was pervaded with a melancholy beauty. He had left feeling that if he had searched harder, he might have found her, that he was leaving her behind. The day coach, which is just like a sort of a bus, he was penniless now, was hot. He went out to the open vestibule and sat down on a folding chair, and the station slid away, and the backs of the unfamiliar buildings moved by. Then out into the spring fields, where a yellow trolley raced them for a minute, with people in it who might once have seen the pale magic of her face along the casual street. Oh, sorry, not bus, train. The track curved, and now it was going away from the sun, which, as it sank lower, seemed to spread itself in benediction over the vanishing city where she had drawn her breath. He stretched out his hand desperately, as if to snatch only a wisp of air to save a fragment of the spot that she had made lovely for him. But it was all going by too fast now for his blurred eyes, and he knew that he had lost that part of it, the freshest and the best, forever. It was 9 o'clock when we finished breakfast and went out on the porch. The night had made a sharp difference in the weather, and there was an autumn flavor in the air. The gardener, the last one of Gatsby's former servants, came to the foot of the steps. I'm going to drain the pool today, Mr. Gatsby. Leaves will start falling pretty soon. There's always trouble with the pipes. Don't do it today, Gatsby answered. He turned to me apologetically. You know, old sport, I've never used that pool all summer. I looked at my watch and stood up. 12 minutes to my train. I didn't want to go to the city. I wasn't worth a decent stroke of work. But it was more than that. I didn't want to leave Gatsby. I missed that train, and then another, before I could finally get myself away. I'll call you up, I said finally. Do, old sport. I'll call you about noon. We walked down the steps. I suppose Daisy'll call, too. He looked at me anxiously, as if he hoped I'd corroborate this. I suppose so. Well, goodbye. We shook hands and I started away. Just before I reached the hedge, I remembered something and turned around. They're a rotten crowd, I shouted across the lawn. You're worth the whole damn bunch put together. I've always been glad I said that. It was the only compliment I ever gave him, because I disapproved of him from beginning to end. First he nodded politely, and then his face broke into that radiant and understanding smile, as if we'd been in ecstatic cahoots on that fact all the time. His gorgeous pink rag of a suit made a bright spot of color against the white steps, and I thought of the night when I first came to his ancestral home 3 months before. The lawn and drive had been crowded with the faces of those who guessed at his corruption, and he had stood on those steps, concealing his incorruptible dream, as he waved them goodbye. I thanked him for his hospitality. We were always thanking him for that, I and the others. Goodbye, I called. I enjoyed breakfast, Gatsby. Up in the city, I tried for a while to list the quotations on an interminable amount of stock. Then I fell asleep in my swivel chair. Just before noon, the phone woke me up, and I started up with sweat breaking out on my forehead. It was Jordan Baker. She often called me up at this hour because the uncertainty of her own movements between hotels and clubs and private houses made her hard to find in any other way. Usually her voice came over the wire as something fresh and cool, as if a divot from a green golf links had come sailing in at the office window, but this morning it seemed harsh and dry. "I've left Daisy's house," she said. "I'm at Hempstead, and I'm going down to Southampton this afternoon." Probably it had been tactful to leave Daisy's house, but the act annoyed me, and her next remark made me rigid. "You weren't so nice to me last night." "How could it have mattered then?" Silence for a moment, then, "However, I want to see you." "I want to see you too." "Suppose I don't go to Southampton and come into town this afternoon?" "No, I don't think this afternoon." "Very well. It's impossible this afternoon. Various—" We talked like that for a while, and then abruptly we weren't talking any longer. I don't know which of us hung up with a sharp click, but I know I didn't care. I couldn't have talked to her across a tea table that day if I never talked to her again in this world. I called Gatsby's house a few minutes later, but the line was busy. I tried 4 times. Finally, an exasperated central told me the wire was being kept open for a long distance from Detroit. Taking out my timetable, I drew a small circle around the 3:50 train. Then I leaned back in my chair and tried to think. It was just noon. When I passed the ash heaps on the train that morning, I had crossed deliberately to the other side of the car. I supposed there'd be a curious crowd around there all day with little boys searching for dark spots in the dust and some garrulous men telling over and over what had happened until it became less and less real even to him, and he could tell it no longer, and Myrtle Wilson's tragic achievement was forgotten. Now I want to go back a little and tell what happened at the garage after we left there the night before. They had difficulty in locating the sister, Catherine. She must have broken her rule against drinking that night, for when she arrived, she was stupid with liquor and unable to understand that the ambulance had already gone to Flushing. When they convinced her of this, she immediately fainted, as if that was the intolerable part of the affair. Someone kind or curious took her in his car and drove her in the wake of her sister's body. Until long after midnight, a changing crowd lapped up against the front of the garage while George Wilson rocked himself back and forth on the couch inside. For a while, the door of the office was open, and everyone who came into the garage glanced irresistibly through it. Finally, someone said it was a shame and closed the door. Mihalis and several other men were with him. First, 4 or 5 men, later 2 or 3 men. Still later, Mihalis had to ask the last stranger to wait there 15 minutes longer, while he went back to his own place and made a pot of coffee. After that, he stayed there alone with Wilson until dawn. About 3 o'clock, the quality of Wilson's incoherent muttering changed. He grew quieter and began to talk about the yellow car. He announced that he had a way of finding out whom the yellow car belonged to, and then he blurted out that a couple of months ago his wife had come from the city with her face bruised and her nose swollen. But when he heard himself say this, he flinched and began to cry, "Oh, my God!" again in his groaning voice. Mihalis made a clumsy attempt to distract him. "How long have you been married, George? Come on there, try and sit still a minute and answer my question. How long have you been married?" 12 years. "Ever had any children? Come on, George, sit still. I asked you a question. Did you ever have any children?" The hard brown beetles kept butting against the dull light, and whenever Mihalis heard a car go tearing along the road outside, it sounded to him like the car that hadn't stopped a few hours before. He didn't like to go into the garage because the workbench was stained where the body had been lying, so he moved uncomfortably around the office. He knew every object in it before morning, and from time to time sat down beside Wilson, trying to keep him more quiet. "Have you got a church you go to sometimes, George? Maybe even if you haven't been there for a long time, maybe I could call up the church and get a priest to come over, and he could talk to you, see?" "Don't belong to any." "You ought to have a church, George, for times like this. You must have gone to church once. Didn't you get married in a church? Listen, George, listen to me. Didn't you get married in a church?" "That was a long time ago." The effort of answering broke the rhythm of his rocking. For a moment he was silent. Then the same half-knowing, half-bewildered look came back into his faded eyes. "Look in the drawer there," he said, pointing at the desk. "Which drawer?" "That drawer. That one." Mihalis opened the drawer nearest his hand. There was nothing in it but a small, expensive dog leash made of leather and braided silver. It was apparently new. "This?" he inquired, holding it up. Wilson stared and nodded. "I found it yesterday afternoon. She tried to tell me about it, but I knew it was something funny." "You mean your wife bought it?" "She had it wrapped in tissue paper on her bureau." Mihalis didn't see anything odd in that, and he gave Wilson a dozen reasons why his wife might have bought the dog leash, but conceivably Wilson had heard some of these same explanations before from Myrtle, because he began saying, "Oh, my God," again in a whisper. His comforter left several explanations in the air. "Then he killed her," said Wilson. His mouth dropped open suddenly. "Who did?" "I have a way of finding out." "You're morbid, George," said his friend. This has been a strain to you, and you don't know what you're saying. You'd better try and sit quiet until morning." "He murdered her." "It was an accident, George." Wilson shook his head. His eyes narrowed, and his mouth widened slightly with the ghost of a superior. "I know," he said definitely. "I'm one of these trusting fellas, and I don't think any harm to nobody. When I get to know a thing, I know it. It was the man in that car. She ran out to speak to him, and he wouldn't stop." Mihalis had seen this too, but it hadn't occurred to him that there was any special significance to it. He believed that Mrs. Wilson had been running away from her husband, rather than trying to stop any particular car. "How could she have been like that?" "She's a deep one," said Wilson, as if that answered the question. "Ah." He began to rock again, and Mihalis stood, twisting the leash in his hand. "Maybe you got some friend that I could telephone for, George." This was a forlorn hope. He was almost sure that Wilson had no friend. There was not enough of him for his wife. He was glad a little later when he noticed a change in the room, a blue quickening by the window, and realized that dawn wasn't far off. About 5 o'clock it was blue enough outside to snap off the light. Wilson's glazed eyes turned out to the ash heaps where small gray clouds took on fantastic shape and scurried here and there in the faint dawn wind. "I spoke to her," he muttered after a long silence. "I told her she might fool me, but she couldn't fool God. I took her to the window." With an effort he got up and walked to the rear window and leaned with his face pressed against it. "And I said, God knows what you've been doing, everything you've been doing. You may fool me, but you can't fool God." Standing behind him, Mihalis saw with a shock that he was looking at the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg, which had just emerged, pale and enormous, from the dissolving night. "God sees everything," repeated Wilson. "That's an advertisement," Mihalis assured him. Something made him turn away from the window and look back into the room, but Wilson stood there a long time, his face close to the window pane, nodding into the twilight. By 6 o'clock, Mihalis was worn out and grateful for the sound of a car stopping outside. It was one of the watchers of the night before who had promised to come back, so he cooked breakfast for 3, which he and the other man ate together. Wilson was quieter now, and Mihalis went home to sleep. When he woke, 4 hours later, and hurried back to the garage, Wilson was gone.